Hi guys, so there is an interesting study I came across. Basically, it's from a Harvard professor who studies social media, and originally what he wanted to do was a study of automated text analysis. Basically, he wanted to determine how accurate the computer program that he was developing was in automatically analyzing text, which sounds pretty boring, but it became very interesting because he wanted to do this study with social media posts that came out of China. And what he quickly realized is that a lot of the posts that he was getting from the internet were deleted a few minutes later. So what it in the end turned out to be is a study of internet censorship in China. Of course, you could also do this in some other countries, and he gives some examples like Vietnam and stuff, and he also says that he's gonna work on that in the future. But for right now, he has done this study with internet censorship in China, and it's really interesting because it's not only some fraction or something. He has developed a system with which he can analyze a broad aspect of the internet and analyze those posts. And now, of course, he's focusing on censorship. And he came up with some very interesting data, which is kind of telling you what exactly is being censored, and also tells you how they operate. It's really interesting. But, a lot of guys have been complaining, oh, I do a 10-minute video and it's already too long and I talk too much. This guy is worse than me. He's, and this is also one of the reasons I didn't go to university is because a lot of the lectures, they are they're saying stuff in many hours that you could say in minutes. And this is one of those guys. He takes much more than an hour to say something that could be said much quicker. Of course, I'm not good at saying stuff quickly either, but I'll try to give you the gist of it, and then I'll show you the video. I hope that's okay and nobody gets me into trouble with copyright again. But I guess it's okay. And I really, my intention is really for more people to look into this study, because it's really interesting and nobody has really taken note of this interesting study, which is a shame. So I just want to help raise awareness of this study. But before I show you the study, because as I said, he's talking a lot and it's very long. It's much more talking than I'm doing. I want to give you the gist of his finds. So, but before that, I have to explain something. When he did that study, that was around 2012 or 2013, around that time. So maybe it was about 3 years ago. All right. So he only looked at the data during that one time period. Maybe it was a time span of maybe 2 or 3 months. Okay, he didn't look at the data much earlier. For example, he didn't look at the data in 2002 or something. So you have to keep this in mind, because his finds are only relevant for the time period in which he did the study. So as I said, he did the study at around 2012, 2013. So his finds were basically that, first off, a lot of people are assuming, especially what is censored in China, is when you post something that is critical of the government, For example, if you say, oh yeah, this guy in government is an asshole, whatever, and that they censor that, and that is their main focus. And what he found in his study is that that's actually not the case. That's not their focus. But what he's not saying is that that's not their focus anymore. Because it wasn't always like that. Because at the beginning of the internet, and the beginning of the internet in China is I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or whatever, it wasn't like that. It wasn't always like that. But right now, I think it's still the case right now. Right now, what is the focus of censorship is not if you say something like, oh, this guy in government is an asshole. That's not what they're censoring. Or that's not their main focus. Their main focus... So basically, to give you an example, it's okay if you post something like, oh, this guy in government is an asshole. That's okay. They're not necessarily gonna take that down. But if you say something like, oh, this guy in government is an asshole, let's do something about it. And I have those concrete steps that we could all take together to do something about that, and maybe call for more democracy, so that we can elect our own officials instead of those assholes in government. They're gonna take that down. And not only are they gonna take that down, they're gonna pay you a visit and invite you for tea. While we're on the topic, inviting you for tea, so instead of saying they're arresting you, you're using something like, oh, they're inviting you for tea. And of course you can do that as well. Instead of saying, I don't know, if you want to talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre, and of course, in the past, it was the moment you mentioned the word Tiananmen Square massacre, that was censored. So people came up with all kinds of other words that could mean the same thing, and especially in Chinese, you have a lot of words that mean something completely different, but that sound similar, and they use that to get around the internet censorship. So instead of saying Tiananmen Square massacre, they use some kind of code name or code word. For a long time they used rubber ducky instead of Tiananmen Square massacre. It sounds funny, but that's what they actually used. Well, of course that didn't. Yeah, in the past this worked. But now that doesn't work anymore because, as the Harvard professor points out in his study, the censorship is not automated. At least it's not automated anymore. It's all done by people. They have hundreds of thousands of employees whose entire job it is to just look at social media posts and stuff and to censor them or not. So anyway, that in the past, it was much more keyword based. In the past they had certain keywords, and as soon as you mentioned those keywords, the post would be blocked. That's not the case anymore. They don't need to do that anymore because now they have those hundreds of thousands of people who are actually looking at the post. So it could be, for example, that you might be using some sensitive keyword, but for example, you could be using the keyword Tibet or Falun Gong, but you could be saying, oh yeah, the government is right in suppressing Falun Gong. So they wouldn't want to, in the past, they even deleted those kinds of posts because it had the keyword Falun Gong. But that's not how it works anymore. It's no longer so much keyword based. Now they have enough people to actually read all those posts. So if you post something like that, it's not gonna get taken down because they have enough people to read it, and then they actually have people who look at the context. And as he said, it's also now shifted, because now it's also it's bad for them if they were to censor everybody who's saying something critical of the government. It gives a better impression of the Chinese government and of the Communist Party if they allow, if at least it looks like they're allowing people to criticize the government. So that's what they're doing now. That's kind of the policy now. So now, even if you use certain keywords, they might allow it. Even if you criticize the government, they might allow it. So it has changed a little, because that's a good thing for them, because then it looks for an outsider, it looks like, oh look, they're starting to stop censoring, you know. But that's not the case. It's just that the focus has changed, you know. And as you can see from the study that this Harvard professor did, they're still very effective in censoring, and they're still censoring a lot. But the main focus is now when you start mobilizing people, you know, when you want to do demonstrations, or you want to, you know, take certain actions. That's the moment they're gonna jump in. And also they have now it's like they don't have sensitive topics that are always sensitive. For example, there could be a certain period of time when certain keywords are okay, but certain other keywords are not okay. You know, that, and even because it's related to certain incidents and so on. He's gonna talk about that some more. There was some time periods where certain keywords are okay, and then some other time period where certain keywords are not okay. It's kind of time sensitive. It depends on the whim of the government, basically, at that period of time. And also this can lead you into a false sense of security, because you feel like, oh, you're not being watched. Or nobody is censoring you, and you go ahead post stuff, and but that's not the case. To give you an example that I didn't witness personally, but some of my friends, that was already a long time ago now. It was around 2002. And some friends of mine who were Falun Gong practitioners, and they were actually people from the same city in Germany that I live in. So they were Germans. And what they did, they went to China as tourists, and then they came up with the idea that they could, basically do a demonstration, you know, against the persecution of Falun Gong in China, on Tiananmen Square. So not so much a demonstration. All they wanted to do is just sit there and meditate, like Falun Gong practitioners have always done. And what they did is they used emails to organize that, basically. And they were like, and they gotten confident because it seemed like nobody was reading their emails, nobody was censoring or stopping those emails or whatever, you know. And also it seemed like, oh, the police were not watching them. So it led them to a false sense of security, because they've been in China for quite some time, and everything was okay. And, you know, at least that's how it seemed, you know. And they were talking about Falun Gong even on the internet and via email, like a lot. And it didn't seem to get them into trouble. So it led them into this false sense of security. And they came up with the idea, okay, let's organize and let's just meditate together on Tiananmen Square. And what happened is, it was like, and I already explained this, the same kind of tactic. I already explained this in my video where I talked about the Stasi. They're not even gonna wait until you get there. They know what you intend to do, and they will not even let you get there. It's the same thing with the Stasi video. You think, you know, in the Stasi video there was about this guy who wrote some kind of who wrote poems that he wanted to get published in the West, and some of those poems were a bit critical about socialism. So you'd think they would wait until he actually goes to the foreign reporter and gives him his poems and talks to the foreign reporter. No, they will not arrest him after he has done that. That wouldn't make sense, because then he has already done what they do not want him to do, right? So what they did in the Stasi video was they arrested him before he even got to that reporter, before he even talked to that reporter. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't even talked to any reporter yet. They just knew that he intended to talk to a reporter, and they arrested him before he could even get there. And it was the same with my friends. They were not, most of them, were not arrested on Tiananmen Square. They didn't even get to do the demonstration they planned. They never got there. They were arrested the day before in their hotel room. Yeah, so, and that's basically how it is still right now. You see, you think you can talk about a lot of stuff, even on the Chinese internet, but well, you can talk about what they want you to talk about, and at certain times they allow you certain things, and at certain times they don't allow you certain things. But the moment you want to mobilize people, and that was really interesting. And as the Harvard professor pointed out, even if you wanted to do, say for example, a demonstration in support of the government, they would censor that. They would not only censor that, they would also arrest you before you could ever do your demonstration. Why? Because they don't want, basically what communism promises you is power in the hands of the people. But that's a lie. They don't want that at all. They don't want any power in the hands of any people for any reason, even if you're supporting communism. They don't want you to support, they don't want you to do your own communist rally or start your own communist party. No, they want to have control over that, naturally. It's fine if you demonstrate in support of communism, but you have to do that in the terms of the Communist Party. They have to be the ones to tell you, oh, now you can go and do that, and they're telling you exactly what you can and cannot do. You cannot organize it on your own. That's what they don't want. And it doesn't matter what it is. They don't want any, they don't want the people to have any say in anything. That's basically what it is all about. And that's also what the study showed of this Harvard professor. So that's their focus, and there was also some very interesting thing, if you listen to what the Harvard professor says to his findings. If you analyze social media, and if you analyze what is getting blocked by censors and what is not getting blocked, it's not always the same thing. There's some pretty interesting stuff, because basically it allows you to predict the future. What? Yeah, in China you can predict the future. I tell you how it works. So, for example, you have some keyword or some topic, and nothing has happened yet. Nothing has happened. No demonstration, no nothing. Nothing has happened. No incident. Nothing has happened. And nobody is getting persecuted for anything yet. Nothing has happened. But suddenly there is a topic or a certain keyword or whatever that suddenly gets censored, and it wasn't censored before. Ta-da! You have your time machine. You can see into the future, because you know that now it's only a matter of days before they start some new campaign persecuting some new people or whatever, and that's really interesting. Yeah. So anyway, I'll show you the video of the Howard professor right now. He talks even more than I do, but I just gave you the gist of it. What he is going to show you is the related data and all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting if you're interested in, in that sort of thing.
So we sat down to do a study of automated text analysis. We had no intention of studying censorship. Okay, there were some methods that I developed with some other folks, and we just wanted to see whether they worked in a hard case, which was Chinese. The language obviously works in a completely different way. There's a firm called Crimson Hexagon, which collects social media posts worldwide. They get all of them, basically. They commercialized some technology that I had come up with previously. So we called them, we got some data from them, some social media posts in China, in Chinese, and they came in a nice little database with the text and the URL, and we're testing out our methods, and methods worked fine. And I said, and Jen and Molly and I decided, let's go back to the websites from which these came, and just make sure that we have the context right. Make sure that we're actually pulling the text from the website rather than like the blog roll or some advertisement or something like that, and just so we understand it. And so they came back and they said, must be something wrong with Crimson Hexagon, with the database we're getting from Crimson Hexagon, because the URL is not associated with the text. When we type the URL into the browser, and we go back to the website, there's nothing there. Sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not there. And all of a sudden we realized, we have a different study than we intended to do. So we totally changed what we were after, and our dependent variable then became censored, not censored. And we had the content of all the uncensored posts, and all the censored posts. Okay. So anyway, that's how the study was born. Jen and Molly fortunately know Chinese, so maybe I do. Yeah, maybe. I know 2 characters. In any event, so let me give you some background on what Chinese censorship is. So first of all, this is not a small operation. This is the largest selective suppression of human expression in the history of the world. In terms of press freedom, of the 197 countries, Freedom House ranks them by some method. That is probably crazy, but always correlates at 0.9 with anything that academics do. China is 187th out of 197. Okay. There's 10 below it, but China is by far and away the biggest of the offenders. We're going to focus on one aspect of censorship, which is the removal of individual posts from the web, so far as we can tell, by hand, not by automated methods. There's other forms of suppressing information. There's the firewall. It's hard to get to Facebook from China. It's hard to get to Google from China. You can, but you have to go through some more effort. But this is the pruning of individual posts is what we're after. It's the biggest piece of their effort. So here's the workforce involved. You can imagine how we figured out who was actually involved and things like that, that's about as much information as I'm going to give you. That was not a joke. That's why no one's laughing. Anyway, so we estimate there's around, or really at least 200,000 people. 200,000 people whose job it is to sit and read posts and decide, nope, yep, nope, yep. Okay. There's internal censors at individual sites. The government requires individual companies to monitor their own websites, and there's many websites in China that provide social media services. So there can be up to 1,000 people at individual websites that their job is basically censorship. They're essentially government employees, but they're employed by the firm. There's internet police, between 20 and 50,000 folks who will come and pick you up if they don't like what you're doing. There's these 50-cent party members who will contribute things to the web, 250 to 300,000 of them. This is a big operation. Okay. There's other examples of folks that mess with the web. The leading favorite places to visit might be Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Vietnam, etc. But we'll work on those in the next talk. So here's our main point. Okay? The prevailing wisdom, if you look at the literature, is that the reason for censorship, or the goal of censorship, or what censorship is doing, is to stop government criticism. So that after you prune the web, anybody that would come to the web and would see what people are saying about the government would see a more positive or rosy view of the government than what was actually the case. That's, most anybody would think that that's what it is, right? And that's what we thought it was too. Turns out it's not true. So in order to convey to you what our finding was, is I'll give you a quote from a BBC reporter who thought he found a contradiction in Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao's farewell speech. Okay, so he quoted, this is from the reporter. Premier Wen claimed that China's leaders welcomed criticism expressed on the internet. It is natural for that criticism to happen, Wen said. Okay? And yet, the reporter says, he, Wen, presides over a government that routinely censors the internet and has imprisoned many who've given voice to their criticism. Right, so the reporter thought he had found Wen in a lie. Okay, and it's sort of a ridiculous lie, right? That the Chinese premier says it's natural for their criticism, yet the government's picking people up and putting them in jail and making them disappear, right? So this is what the BBC reporter said. What we found, what we show, and what I'll show you that we can show, is that there's no contradiction. Although taking the words of a Chinese leader is not a particularly good empirical method of research, Wen Jiabao, it appears, was totally sincere, and also he was accurate. Okay. China, it turns out, allows plenty of criticism in social media. There are millions of vitriolic posts about the Chinese government, every aspect of them. China's censorship is not leaky and imperfect, which is what the academics said it was. Like, you could look at the web and you could find criticism, and people would say, because everybody was looking small, they were only looking at a few posts at a time, and they would find some criticism, they would say, oh, the censors are just not good at their job. Okay. It turns out that censors are incredibly good at their job. They're just not doing that job or the job that we thought that they were doing. Okay. What's leaky and imperfect is our understanding of what they're doing. So we're sort of the first to look at the entire web all at the same time, right? And I'll explain what I mean. So the goal, it turns out, and this was our finding, our main finding, is that what the Chinese censorship program is designed to do is not to stop criticism, but to stop collective action. They want to clip social ties. They're happy for you to say whatever you want about some local leader or some national leader, right? Whatever you want, okay? But if you want to move people into Tiananmen Square, or you want to move people to protest about your local government, or you want to move people to come to your barbecue and there's 1,000 of them, you're in big trouble, okay? It doesn't matter whether it's for the government or against the government. They don't want control over the movements of people to be in the hands of anybody but the government. Everybody follow? Someone go like this. Okay, good. Okay, there's two other smaller categories that they go after, and I'll explain those when we get to it. Okay. So our data source I mentioned is this company Crimson Hexagon. They collect all social media posts worldwide. They're collecting about 1 billion every 2.2 days, something like that. So it's an amazing development in sort of the history of the world that humans speak, and it's all recorded for our research purposes, right? So that's how I imagine it. But it's a really terrific research opportunity, and I think more people ought to study it. So in the United States, most social media posts go through Twitter and Facebook and just a few Blogspot, just a few WordPress, through a few of the providers. In China, the social media landscape is fractured. Because in our data, we have 1,400 or so websites that provide social media posts, and we get data from all of them. There are probably more than these. This is yours? Yeah, mine's not round, but I think I have to squish this in a little. Anyway, so this is a pie chart of just how big they are. So there's an extremely long tail. There's some big ones, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Just to give you a feel, basically, for this is actually an enormous opportunity for research, because not only is it all going through one place in a standardized format, but they're going through localities, which we can geolocate, so we know where they are. And the local social media providers are usually taking social media posts from people who are local. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. And so there's lots of other opportunity for doing other kinds of research in China. So for this particular study, we first collected about 3.5 million social media posts in 85 different topic areas that we defined over 6 months to get a sense of what was going on. We studied a random sample of more than 100,000 of these in more depth. We repeated the whole design. And so I'm going to talk today about 11 million social media posts that we analyzed. For each one, we have a timeline. There's a timeline of over a 6-month period in each of 85 different topic areas that we defined. I'll mention actually, what we did first is we came up with these topic areas just because the web is so broad and so chaotic and there's so many different things they talk about that you can't just go out there and say, oh, what are people saying on Twitter? It is just too much stuff. So we broke it down into these categories just to have a feel for it. And actually at first what we did is we had a set of highly sensitive categories, medium sensitivity, and then low sensitivity, just trivial things. And we thought that would be a first breakdown of what was going on in social media so we could get a sense of what was being censored. It turns out the highly censored ones were only slightly more, the highly sensitive ones were only slightly more censored than the low sensitive ones. So it wasn't about that. In any event, for each post in each one of these topic areas on a timeline, we'll download the content pretty much the instant it appears. We'll then, from websites all over the world, go back to the website to see whether it was taken down. Okay. So you can imagine the engineering challenges to do this. What we need to do is keep going back to the website, right, many times, because we want to know when it was taken down. If you do that, that's called a denial of service attack. So you can't, or it'll be against the terms of use of individual sites. So you can't do that. You can't always come from Gary's computer, or Gary's going to be in big trouble. They probably can't all come from Harvard, or my employer's going to be right. So we have websites. We have places all over the world that will work on this, including inside China, that will ping the site, go back to the page, and see whether it's there. And so then for every post, for each one of these posts, we know when it happened, we know when it was originally posted, we know if and when the Chinese government took it down and when. So we then use computer-assisted methods of text analysis, some existing, some we adapted to Chinese, some we did some other stuff to figure out what was in there. If you're a qualitative scholar and you say it's much better to read things, I totally agree, but we'd be doing the study for the rest of our lives and wouldn't come close to finishing it. Right? So you have no choice but to use automated methods of text analysis. If we automated everything and just sort of counted keywords, we would definitely lose a lot of stuff. And so I think the right movement in this field is computer-assisted technologies, and that's sort of what we did. And so we used a team of people reading, and then we took their insights and automated their insights and then applied it to millions and millions of posts. Just to give you a feel, the censors are not ashamed of what they're doing. They don't hide it. It's not ambiguous either. So when we go to find the post originally, this one said, "Sorry, the host you were looking for does not exist, has been deleted, or is being investigated." Right. So in case you're not sure, right, and in case you really don't want it, here's a different one. The page you requested is temporarily down. How about you go look at another page? And if you still don't get it, in the bottom here is Jing Jing, one of China's cartoon internet police. It's a little hard to see that, but this is a little police officer coming out of his little booth. Okay, so this is really clear. Okay, so we know when it was taken down by the government and when it wasn't. The censors are fast. But they're not as fast as we are, because we can automate things. So here's just one example. We've done this lots of times. There was a crash in the Shanghai subway system. There was a lot of posts about it. You can imagine people being enraged about this crash. This is the number of posts. This is the days since it was written. And you can see that the Chinese censors get about almost all of them, certainly 90% of them, within the first 24 hours. Okay. So imagine you had 200,000 research assistants, and it was your job to implement this policy. Think of how hard this would be. Okay. First, there's this event, and you call up everybody, like, wait, come back into work. Okay. And then you say, okay, here's the coding rules, and then you say, okay, start reading, and make decisions about whether each one should be censored. Okay. Getting that right with a high degree of intercode reliability would be an enormous task. Okay? So this is an extremely expert operation with an enormous number of people. It would be really hard to pull this off, and they pull it off with very high precision. Okay? But think of our engineering task now. We had to basically deal with this within 24 hours, right? We had to go back to the website from which it came sort of continuously within that day to figure it out. We're not interested in censorship 2 years after the post appears, right? We want to know in real time what's happening. So I mentioned that there were two other types of censorship, or there are two other goals of censorship. They're smaller goals, but here's what they are. So one is they censor pornography. I'm going to show you some more graphs like these. So let me show you the context here. So the volume is the gray bar here. This is just a sample, by the way, but the volume is the gray bar, and in front is the red, which they censored. So the red will never be above the gray because it's the number that were censored. So you can see what's happening is the volume of pornography is going up and down, and they're trying to censor all of them. They miss a few, but they get most of them. Okay. Some of the misses they're actually not missing, but it's our techniques that are missing. And when we go back and look at the individuals, we can clean it up. But in any event, they're basically they're trying to take all the pornography off the web. If you ask them, which we have, they think of that as sort of the same thing as moving people. Yes, pornography can move people, but they think of what they're doing as helpful to society, because if they don't want the moral whatever to degrade, and you have pornography on the web and all that falls apart. Similarly, you censor movements of people because you don't want the society to break up into chaos. That's their reasoning. Here's my favorite part. There's the only other form of censorship that we've detected is criticism of the censors. You can criticize the prime minister, you can criticize your local mayor, you can criticize anybody else on social media, but if you criticize the people doing the censoring, you're in big trouble. So of all of the things in the world that are inappropriate, this is like meta inappropriate, don't you think? It's like, what exactly is going on? Well, if you control the organs of censorship, then that's what you can do. So these are two topics that don't work like everything else. Okay, and they don't work like everything else for two reasons. First, because they're always censored, and second, they're based upon just these specific topics. Okay, so let me show you now the vast majority of social media. So for most topics, censorship doesn't just, or even posting doesn't just happen. It's actually very bursty. So what happens is the volume sort of goes around, and then all of a sudden there's this enormous spike in some discussion about some issue. And you sort of see this happen in the United States on, if you follow Facebook, right? All of a sudden there's somebody puts something up there with a really funny cat picture, and a lot of people comment on it, right? Or in Twitter, there's some guy that says something that'll really get you, and it's retweeted 1,000 times, right? That's what social media is. It's very, very bursty. And so this is an example of a burst. So we realized that that's actually very fundamental to what social media is. It's the bursts. So we actually focus on the bursts. We make, for this part of the analysis, we make the unit of analysis the volume burst, just in posting, not in censoring.
The gray are uncensored messages.
The gray is the total number of messages. Oh, do you want to? I can just repeat it. The gray is
the gray are the uncensored messages. Do I understand that?
Actually, the gray are the messages that are put on the web, some of which are censored, they're in red, and some of which are not censored, which peak out above the red. So yeah, so the difference between the two is the uncensored. Okay. So we want to first detect the volume bursts. Okay, so we have a method where you're following a time series and all of a sudden there's a burst, and we have sort of sophisticated method of capturing automatically when the burst happens. It's almost exactly equivalent to taking all the data, calculating the standard deviation, and finding any time it goes above 3 standard deviations from the original. Okay, so you can just think of it as 3 standard deviations above the normal variability. That's a burst. We monitored in this part of the analysis 85 topic areas between January and July in 2011. We found in those 85 areas 87 volume bursts. So some areas did not have any volume bursts, some had 1, some had 2, etc. We then went back and looked at the event that the volume burst was associated with. Sometimes there's an event, people would get outraged and they would all talk about it. Sometimes there was nothing that was happening in the real world, but they start talking about something in the real world, and you can figure out what they're talking about. So there was some event, some thing, some focus that they had. So we now have 87 volume bursts and the associated real world event. I especially like that, it used to be when I would study social media, people would always ask, oh, how representative is it of like public opinion or something like that? Now social media is such a large part of people's lives, nobody cares about that. They just want to know what, it basically is reality, right? Anyway, so we have 87 volume bursts in the 85 topic areas. We have the event associated with each of the volume bursts. Okay. So now, here's the theories. The goals of Chinese censorship are, there's two theories. This is incredibly simple and wonderful from an academic point of view only. So the purpose of Chinese censorship is, number one, possibly to stop criticism of the state. Number two, our alternative theory that we came up with from the data, so it's going to, you know how this is going to turn out, is to stop collective action. Okay, now, you know how most academic works happen? You say, well, there's these two theories, and in the end, we're more right than you. Look, p equal 0.0499, right? With two asterisks, right? Okay, this is why the paper doesn't have a lot of math. Okay, there's math in there, but either one of these could be right or could be wrong. Here's the answer. The first one's wrong, the second one's right. Okay, it's just really unambiguous. Okay, it's not often that you get to say that. So our central hypothesis is that the rules the censors follow work as follows. They monitor many broad topic areas. They detect volume bursts. They identify the real world events associated with the volume bursts. They select events that could or did generate the collective action. All right, so some of those events are collective action, have collective action potential, and some don't. So they're focusing on the events. They then censor all the posts within the bursts about the events that have collective action potential, all of them, whether they're for the state or against the state. They then judge individual posts only for their association with the events, not for the individual post's collective action potential. It would be too hard to do that. If you had to read individual posts and decide whether that was going to generate other people moving around in ways that you said, sometimes it would be clear, and many times it would be ambiguous. And to get a high level of intercoder reliability between you and you, it'd be really hard. Okay? However, if it's the events that I'm focusing on, and I censor all of the posts, positive for the government or negative for the government, within the volume burst associated with that collective action potential event, then it's a much easier coding task. Okay. So just to be clear, the government censors all the posts, regardless of how critical or supportive of the state, in volume bursts associated with events with collective action potential. Yeah. Pause that thought while we get your microphone.
Sure. So looking at this, your hypothesized set of rules, it seems that this is the kind of thing that could just as easily be automated as done by 200,000 people. What makes you think that this isn't automated?
Because if we were in charge of the automation, we would be able to greatly reduce the amount of hand coding, but we wouldn't be able to eliminate it. I don't think that just the methods of individual classification are not there. Like you wouldn't be able to do what they're doing by automated means. So we could make it easier for them, but I'm not going to take that consulting project.
Is there any evidence that the government censors things in a way to achieve a given end? For example, let's say the government wants to go after corruption in certain areas.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll tend to allow that criticism instead of government directly attacking this corruption area. Just in order to achieve certain social goals.
Well, the government seems to allow criticism. I think it's because when they're criticizing local officials, the government gets to know about it. So I don't think that. I think only in retrospect do I think that actually this makes sense from their perspective. Would they actually let some things go on that they might normally censor Yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of thing. I mean, I think there's a lot of competition within the government and stuff like that. The government is not a monolith, right? There's disagreement and chaos between different forms. Chaos is the wrong word, but confusion between and competition between different levels of government. So we've found some of these. So the official. Sorry, I'm just looking for some place where the sun is not shining in my eyes. Oh, here we go. So we found some examples where the local government, where on a local website, they're censoring a particular topic, and and nationally in media, in newspapers and things like that, they're not censoring it. They're actually running the stories. So that seems like an example where there's a competition or a disagreement between the local and the national government that's being revealed to us. Right? I mean, a cool thing about the project overall that I like is that this is a gigantic program that was designed to suppress information, and yet what's happening is the suppression agent is this gigantic elephant which leaves these huge footprints, right? And so we get to see a lot of the intent of the state that we wouldn't be able to see otherwise.
Yeah, I want to ask about, so you have detect volume burst and then identify the events and then censor. But it seems like they would already know what the events are, and they could start censoring before the volume burst ever happened, in which case your sample of volume burst would already be censored volume burst.
Okay, that's an excellent point. There are some things that they know ahead of time that they do want to censor when the burst comes, because they know that a burst is going to come. And the cool thing about that is that means that if we see the percent censorship over time, and all of a sudden it goes up, and we don't know about the events, but they do, we should be able to predict what they're going to do. And on my last set of slides, I'll show you that. Okay. There are other events, however, that they don't know anything about. The Shanghai subway crash I just gave you. You don't know ahead of time. There's other kinds, some dissident just sort of mouths off about something, right? Or makes a plea for something. There's a lot of events that they don't know about ahead of time. So they would like to. But.
So I'm interested in number 3, where you say that they select events that could generate collective action. So I'm wondering if there are certain topics that have always been censored and always are censored. Then how would you be able to tell the difference between them identifying this is a topic that could generate collective violence, or whether they're actually censoring it on the substantive aspects of it?
That's a good question. I'll tell you how we define these things. Obviously, if there's a topic that they have suppressed all information and people self-censor, if people self-censor, and then we don't have any evidence of it, But I think that that's not most of what goes on. I think it probably is in some areas, but I think for the most part, what is dangerous to the state is not the spread of information. What seems to be dangerous to the state is the movement of people. And so they can make it harder to get information, but they can't eliminate it completely, usually, I think. But, okay, so let me go a little further, because I think this will answer some of your questions. So our evidence is based on 3 increasingly specific tests based upon the post volume, the nature of the event generating each of the volume bursts, and then the specific content of the posts. And then I'll get to your point about actually predicting what's going to happen. So on post volume, so we began with our 87 volume bursts in the 85 different topic areas. For each burst, just to standardize a little, we calculated what we called censorship magnitude. You can think of it as basically percent censorship, but what we did is we also subtracted out the level of censorship that existed before the burst, which might be different in different areas. Turns out it wasn't that. This isn't that much standardization, so if you want to just make believe that this is percent censorship, that's okay with me. So if the goal of censorship is to stop collective action as we're claiming, then we expect on average the percent censored should increase during volume bursts, and some bursts associated with the events that are really going to move people should have much higher censorship. So let's first, at a first level of looking at the data, look at censorship magnitude for all the posts. I'm sorry, for all the volume bursts. And this is what censorship magnitude looks like. So there's a big pile of them censored around 0, and then 0 means there's no more censorship during the burst than the baseline level before the burst. Okay? So there's a big sort of normally distributed bump there, and then there's a long tail, only on the right-hand side, of much more highly censored posts. We have to look at what those are, but I think we have a little bit of evidence now about what's happening. Okay, so let me go another step to the nature of the event generating the increases in the volume. So we need an event classification. This gets at your question. So we have to actually classify the events. Now I'm going to give you 5 categories. Each category could be could include posts that are for the state, against the state, or neutral. So the first one is events with collective action potential. So this is how we define it very specifically. It's protest or organized crowd formation outside the internet. So if that's actually happening, then that has collective action potential, obviously, because it already has collective action reality. Second is if they're posts about or events associated with individuals who have organized or incited collective action on the ground in reality in the past, then we expect it also has collective action potential. And third, and there's only three points here, it's topics related to nationalism or nationalist sentiment that have also incited protest or collective action in the past. Any other topic, event, at some point every topic generates some kind of collective action, but we're ruling all of those others out. This is our definition, a very specific definition of bursts, events associated with bursts that have what we call collective action potential. Second category is criticism of the censors. Third is pornography. Fourth is news about any other subject aside from the ones we have listed here. And fifth are specific comments about government policies. So these are our categories into which we'll put these events. And what we find is collective action potential. See that collective action potential is censored. We find criticism of the censors is censored. Pornography is censored. But news about all kinds of subjects, no matter how sensitive you might think they are, is not censored, and government policies is not censored. Okay, so that's what we're gonna find. So what types of events are censored? This is the same histogram, but now I'm going to classify it by the events. Okay. So just to give you, these are my 5 categories. Right? I've just now color-coded them. And you can see policy and news are over here on the left, which is not censored any different in the volume burst than outside, approximately. And then the long tail is almost exclusively collective action, criticism of the censors, or pornography. Okay. So it's a screamingly clear test, confirmation of the hypothesis. Okay. There's very high censorship of these 3 things and not much of these other policies. Okay? Okay. Just to give you another zoom in, and let's look at the events that are the events that are the most censored and the events that are the least censored. The ones in the middle are just in the middle, so I don't have them all there. Protests in Inner Mongolia. Let's see, the red ones are protests in Zhengcheng. Ai Weiwei, remember Ai Weiwei? He's the guy that made that bird's nest-like stadium in the Olympics. Do you remember that? He after the Olympics started tweeting things that turned him into a dissident. Advocacy for environmental lottery, the Fuzhou bombing. Those are things with collective action potential. There's the yellow ones are pornography. We found the pornographers still make money there, right? So they have to get their word out somehow. So they disguise some pornography as news that we detected. You can believe me, if you look at it, you know what. Right? What does it do? You know it when you see it. That's it. Okay. Pornography mentioning some popular book. They just attach ads to some popular book, etc. Okay. Down at the bottom, these are events that were not censored at all. Disney announces a new theme park. A popular book was published in audio format. John Huntsman steps down as ambassador to China. But look at this, food prices rise. Education reform for migrant children. No smoking, there's a lot of smoking in China, but you can't smoke indoors. Smoking, right? These things could generate activity, but there's no problem there. Okay. Okay, so now let's zoom in and get a clearer look at what's going on. This is an example of censoring collective action. This was when Ai Weiwei was arrested. So here's the posts about Ai Weiwei. So these are posts about Ai Weiwei. This is the percent censored. There's always some baseline level of censorship, not because they're necessarily really going after Ai Weiwei, but our definition of a topic area is always has some fuzz in it, right? And so then sometimes there's things talked about in other topic areas that overlap. So anyway, there's some little baseline level. You can think of that as sort of measurement error. And then there's this enormous burst of discussion because Ai Weiwei was arrested. That was the event, which you're right, they knew ahead of time. And they start censoring essentially immediately. Right? The percent censored is extremely high here. And you can see that it's actually a difficult task, right? If they were just leisurely going along and pruning the internet, it'd be one thing. But if most of their activity, most of the censorship activity is in compressed periods of time, that's just a hard thing to pull off, right? Most of the censorship they want to do is during these volume bursts, and they do it incredibly well. Okay. Let's see, this is protests in Inner Mongolia happen here, and they essentially take down, the entire spike. So that's censoring collective action. This is the one-child policy. One-child policy. Think of how controversial this would be anywhere in the world. Okay, you can only have one kid. Okay, there's some bursts of discussion about this policy, and censorship stays low the entire time. They just ignore it. So you can imagine what people are saying about this. There's not much positive comments about the fact that they're not allowed to have more than one kid. Okay, there's enormous bursts of negative comments about the government. No censorship. Okay. This is power prices. You can imagine there being a lot of controversy about power prices and criticism of the government for letting them go high. There's power shortages. The government raises the prices to try to curb demand, to try to deal with it, so there's no blackouts. No sense. You can imagine what these are about. They're negative comments about the government. Censorship stays low. Jason.
Gary, so so the one-child policy could take a lot of people onto the street. So is the government not? So I know you're finding that sometimes they're censoring and sometimes you're not, and then you're inferring that it's about collective action. But suppose that there were protests about one-child policy. Would you have? In other words, I don't know what you can say about the Chinese government. I mean,
Well, if there are protests about the key word in what you said is there were protests about the one-child policy. So then people are moving, right? And then discussion would be about that event, which would be about the protests. The policy doesn't really matter for this, right? And then that would be collective action potential events. Right?
Okay. So you have no way. You don't have a theory for when the Chinese decide what is potentially a collective action issue and what isn't.
No, I think that's clever political actors will try to use social media and other people for whatever they can do. And sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. And that's what the Chinese government is obsessed with, right? And for good reason, I think. Right. Okay, so third test of the hypothesis is the content of the posts. Okay, so we adapted this algorithm, which we call README, from Dan Hopkins and I came up with it to work in Chinese. Just a quick little methods detour. We standardized the encoding of Chinese text, get rid of punctuation and stop words. Chinese words are made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 characters, and there's no spaces in Chinese, so you don't know what word is what word, what characters belong to which word. And so there are algorithms to chunk it up and to decide what the words are, and so we dealt with those. We calculate the quantity of interest, which is not the percent in a category, but the percent censored by category. So there's a little bit of Bayes' algorithm. But in any event, what happens is here's an example of our validation. We take some data, in this case from labor strikes in 2010. We hand-coded 1,000 posts. We coded them into 4 categories. About these labor strikes: facts supporting the employers, supporting the workers; opinions supporting the workers; opinions supporting the employers. These are the percent in each of the categories: 20%, 30%, 40%, 10%. Okay. We then divided up the data set into 100 in a training set. So that's where we would read, and we would take the insights from human beings. We'd then use our automated method to amplify that human intelligence, apply it to the 900, and see whether we could estimate what was in the 900 without requiring Harvard undergraduates to read the 900 posts. And these are confidence intervals around our estimates, and so it does perfectly fine. We can estimate where the truth is of the 900 from just the 100 coded and the words in the 900. Everybody follow me? Okay. So basically, this just validates that we don't have to sit and read millions of posts. We can use automated methods, or computer-assisted methods. Okay. So overall, we're interested in distinguishing this state critique theory, like they censor the ones that are critical of the government, and they don't censor the ones that are not critical of the government, or a collective action theory in which they're censoring the ones that have collective action potential and not the ones that don't have collective action potential. So you can sort of go back and forth here, and you realize that it's the diagonals that test the theory. Okay. So what we did is here are posts. We're going to analyze posts in 3 different topic areas that are associated with events that had collective action potential. And we're going to divide them up and calculate the percent censorship among the posts that support the state and the posts that oppose the state. So in posts about Ai Weiwei, the percent censorship among those that criticize the state is about 75 or 80%. Among those that support the state is even higher, actually. And the censorship is even higher. But basically, these are approximately the same. In the Fuzhou bombing, they're about the same. In protests in Inner Mongolia, the degree of censorship among the posts that criticize the state and among the posts that support the state are about the same. Okay? So in areas with collective action potential, there's relatively high censorship in all 3 of these, and whether the individual posts are for or against the state doesn't matter. Okay? Now let's switch to posts without collective action potential. I'm going to click, and you see those, the red and green are up near the top. I click, and the red and green with 3 different areas which don't have collective action potential are now all near the bottom. Everybody see? So there's no collective action potential. This is one-child policy, corruption policy, and corruption policy, like about the leaders, right? And rising food prices. And whether under one-child policy you write posts that criticize or support the state, it's not much censored. Whether you're writing posts about how much you hate government officials because they're corrupt, or you think actually you shouldn't treat them so harshly, they're not censored. And the same thing with food price rises. Hang on just one second.
I'm wondering if the corruption policy here, is it all national corruption, or is it national and local, or do you have any way of disaggregating that?
There is a way to decide that, but it involves me going and reading my paper. I just don't recall which it was.
So I guess I'm curious because...
I think it was national, but...
Okay, so I'm curious because I think a lot of other studies have argued that kind of anecdotally, and they've looked at some data, like posting criticism about local corruption is encouraged by the state government, and it's kind of widely done. But if we're thinking about collective action potential, you could make the argument that those cases are probably the easiest to mobilize, right? Because all these people are already living in the same area, and it's something that impacts them in a very direct manner. Yet, in general, it kind of seems like these things aren't censored. So I was just wondering if you guys have a chance to look at that.
I think almost any topic, a very clever politician could mobilize people. Almost any topic. I mean, in the United States, it was about whether Barack Obama had a birth certificate that was from the United States, right? A previous president was whether we should have an amendment to the Constitution about not desecrating the flag, and there's plenty on the other side as well. So basically, a clever politician can make hay out of almost anything. So I think you can't just classify based on the topic, and you have to see what's happening. I think that's the story. So, So in any event, national corruption policy, I'm pretty sure, we show that there's not much censorship either way. So, okay, so here's uncensored posts.
Actually, Gary, we might just take this 1 second for those who do have to leave at 2. This might be your moment,
Okay.
since we have a little bit of a natural
Okay.
break from the question. So if anybody has to leave, now is the time, and if not, please stay till the end.
You may leave, but we're going to note who you are. This is great, and we all wait for the elevator. Should we continue? Okay. Okay. So let's zoom in a little more and have a look at exactly what the posts are. So here's some uncensored posts that are very critical of the state. Right? These shouldn't exist. Okay? They don't have collective action potential, so they weren't censored. So it's sort of the top right corner here, which under state critique theory should be censored, but under collective action theory or not. So I'm just going to read this post. So this is a city government, Yulin City, that treats life with contempt. This is government officials run amok. A city government without justice, a city government that delights in that which is vulgar, a place where officials all have mistresses. Okay, this is about them personally. Right? A city government that is shameless with greed. The translation has I should read it in Chinese. Some of you can read it in Chinese and you'll get a feel for it. This is an all-out attack on the specific people who lead Yulin City in China. Okay? This was not censored. It's still up there. It's not hard to find. And it's not censored because it's not associated with an event with collective action potential. Here's a censored post supporting the state. Okay? So that's in the bottom corner here, where collective action theory would say that it would be censored, but it supports the state, so state critique theory would say that it wouldn't be censored, but it was censored. So this post was censored. Let me explain what this is before I read it. So there was a bombing and the government. Sorry, what happened here? The government demolished some. The government demolished some housing. Somebody got upset and it was basically terrorism, right? Okay, so this person is supporting the government, which well, let me read it. Makes sense. The bombing, which was the bad thing that the government didn't like, led not only to the tragedy of the death of this worker, but the death of many government workers. Even if we can verify what this guy said on Weibo, Weibo is sort of the Twitter of China, that the building demolition caused a great deal of personal damage, we should still condemn what he did, which was protest what the government was doing. Okay? So this person is supporting the government. The government has continually put forth, the government has continually put forth measures and laws to protect the interests of citizens in building demolition. The media has called attention to the plight of those experiencing housing demolition, right? Because they had to demolish the housing. And here's my favorite line: the rate at which compensation for housing demolition has increased exceeds inflation. Isn't that great? In many places, but this is good. These are serious comments. In many places, this compensation can change the fate of an entire family. Okay? So this person was supporting the state, but it was on a topic that was associated with collective action, and they censored it. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so now I'm going to switch, and I'm going to show the topic that you presaged after I take this.
This is just a clarification. So censorship always means just complete 100% removal. There's never like more subtle modification of this or that. It's just either it exists or it doesn't, following the censorship.
Yeah, yes. They just take it down, basically. They do have these people that we think post things on the web, but they don't seem to take a post and add the word not. Right?
So one of the things I'm finding confusing about this is that you're saying that any topic can incite collective action. And so that means that at one time housing policy could, and then at another time it couldn't.
Could.
And the thing that gets confusing is now you're organizing this around topics, right? And so the topic that you just mentioned didn't at one time produce collective action, but at another time it did. I mean, ideally, wouldn't you like to be studying bursts
Well, we
rather
are
than
actually.
topics?
Actually, we collected the data originally in topic areas. We detected the bursts, and our unit of analysis is the burst, just as you say, not the topic
So
area.
sort of a post hoc thing where you're taking the topic and attributing it.
Well, we had to have some way of taking this enormous fire hose of information coming out, and so we put it into these topic areas. Once it's in the topic areas, we then detect the bursts. The burst is our unit of analysis. We then, at that point, figure out what the event was associated with the burst, and we're analyzing the bursts. Okay.
Okay, let's say a post at the time does not incite collective action. And a year later, something comes up, and suddenly that post becomes relevant to inciting collective action. Will they go back a year and delete all those posts made a year ago? Or it's just the current ones that matter?
Yeah, we have detected some deletion that happens long after events. I haven't studied that enough to know if that's a systematic pattern or they just come upon it and they delete it. I'm not really sure. My guess is old posts don't matter that much. I mean, who reads old Facebook posts? You know, so. Okay. So last point. We didn't design our study as a forecasting study, but it should probably be the case, as the question earlier suggested, that if the government knows that an event is going to happen, and they often don't, they usually don't, but sometimes they do, and if they start censoring ahead of time, then it should be the case that we can see things that nobody else who watches China can see. And we can know what they're going to do before any of the media or anybody else would have any idea. Okay? So here's what we did. Let me explain it ahead of time first. So what we did is we looked for events which were not predictable. First of all, a lot of events are, like if unemployment statistics are going to come out tomorrow, everybody's going to be talking about unemployment statistics, and we know perfectly well. We also looked for events that had collective action potential, because those are the ones that we're interested in. Okay, so so we looked for those events. We found 3. Okay, so so here's one example. This is Ai Weiwei's arrest. So this is the date line horizontally. The vertical axis is the percent censored. Okay, so the percent of posts censored. If you just look at this time series, what happened was percent censored is relatively low. I don't know if you can see. Can you see that dot? Oh, okay. So percent censored is relatively low, and then it jumps up. It stays pretty high. It gets even higher. Okay. Now, what happened in the real world? Over here, this dark line here, Ai Weiwei was arrested. That was a big shock. Okay. He didn't know that this was going to happen. I mean, we might have been able to guess, but it happened. That was a surprise. Okay. So, could we have predicted that ahead of time? It happened already. We were not predicting it, but could we have predicted that? So we know this event happened here. We look at the percent censored, and it looks like 5 days before he was arrested, percent censorship started going up for no reason that we can think of. Okay? So here's our hypothesis. The government finally got fed up with this guy. They decided they're going to take him down. Okay? They're going to pick him up. Okay? And they send the word to the censors. They say, shut down comments about Ai Weiwei. And percent censorship goes from about 10% to about 30%. So this is a tripling right here. Okay? So they start censoring tons of things about comments about Ai Weiwei. It's not 100% because he's an artist. There's a lot of things about him that you might want to leave up. In any event, so it triples. Okay? And then they pick him up. That's the hypothesis. Okay? So how do we analyze data like this to figure out whether we didn't just make that story up? Okay? So one thing we can do is we can do it as a case control study, which is, so what we do is we imagine this 5-day, we imagine that there was a decision made on March 29th. Okay? We take the data before March 29th and we project it forward. Right? We make a prediction as to what the percent censorship would be on April 3rd, which is right here. Okay? And it would be about here. Okay? And then we look at the actual and we say, oh, it's higher. Okay? So that's a little bit of evidence. I could be making that up, right? I could be totally making that up. Right? I mean, maybe I'm fitting it to the data. So we could go one more step. We can run a placebo test. We can say, oh, you know what? I knew that something actually happened on April 3rd. right? I knew that something happened then. And so I just came up with an after the fact, post hoc justification. So why don't we now change April 3rd to every other date, one at a time, and see whether we would have come up with the same result. So that's what the placebo test is, right? We look for every other breakpoint, and we compare this breakpoint to that breakpoint. We do that, and this one is the most extreme difference between predicted and actual of any of the other breakpoints. Proof, no, but it's sort of an indication that we might have known ahead of time that this happened. We have two other examples of this. This is the peace agreement in the South China Sea. So here's what happens. The sea between Vietnam and China, all of a sudden they discover oil. And both countries take an unnatural interest in this body of water. Right? They decide this is a very interesting body of water. And they're shooting across each other's bow. In the media reports, right up to a peace treaty being signed at this line, right up to that day, you'll find media reports where they're talking about, is there going to be a war? What's going to happen? Are they going to do something? Right? So what happened? We don't really know what happened, but here's my hypothesis. Here's the percent censorship. Percent censorship is going up. It's no surprise it's going up because the media reports have more and more conflicts between China and Vietnam, and China is very protective of international, the government of China is protective of international connections. So it's going up and going up. The media reports keep going, and censorship falls through the floor. Okay? We run our test here, and the difference between predicted and actual is huge. Okay? So what happened? I think what happened is they knew they were going to come to an agreement with Vietnam. They knew they were going to sign the peace treaty. And they said to the censors, we were having you censor everything. Just forget it. We're okay. They didn't announce that to the public. The media didn't know about it. The media is still talking about, right up to here, is still talking about whether there's going to be a war. But we could tell ahead of time, I think, that. Now, is this a just so story? Is this an after the fact story? So we did another placebo test. We looked at all the other breakpoints. And again, this was the most extreme of all the other breakpoints. It's a good story, right? Here's another one. This is the last one.
It also suggests finite resources for censorship resources. Other, like, we have better use for these 200,000, or we might have, and so why waste it? We have this one under control.
It could be. That could be. It could have been finite resources, and they're aiming it at something else. That's possible. Last one was this actually wasn't during our observation period, but we happened to leave our monitors running, and the Boshi Lai incident happened. I don't know if you know about this, but this is like the biggest scandal in China in 20 years. And the first incident was Wang Lizheng's demotion. Right? So that was like this big thing. Like, so everybody knew at that moment something weird is going on with the Chinese leadership, and that eventually led to Boshi Lai's wife being convicted of murder and him being thrown out of the Politburo, and it was a huge problem. Okay, here's the percent censorship on Boshi Lai, where it's basically going down, and then all of a sudden, it's going down. Over here is the demotion. The percent censorship, if we just look at, on the basis of information before 5 days ahead of time, would be around here, or maybe here if you run it flat. The actual censorship was much higher. So the theory is that, or my one possible interpretation is, again, they knew ahead of time, we have had enough of Boshi Lai. Okay, we're gonna start doing stuff. So they make him demote this guy. Censorship starts getting high. There's absolutely nothing in the media about this. Okay, he's demoted here. Censorship stays high, and then all the other events happen. Again, we run a placebo test. Again, this is the most extreme of all the events. Okay. In any event, to confirm that we can predict things that nobody else would know, we have to do the study as a predictive study and actually make claims ahead of time before they're there. But I think there's some indication here that this gigantic government program designed to suppress the flow of information is actually providing information to us researchers. Can you just...
You're just talking about percentage of posts, but how does certainly the volume of the post is going to affect censorship. So do you have a constant volume of posts across that same period?
Well, actually, the volume of posts does affect censorship, but not in the way that you would expect. When there's more volume, there's a higher percentage of censorship, right? So, yeah, I don't have the volume on this, but it wasn't material. But I don't have the number in my head. So just to conclude, Chinese censorship program stops collective action, not criticism. It seems to reveal government intentions, predict actions. We have this methodology, which was actually the original purpose of us doing this. We have automated text analysis methods validated in Chinese. We have millions and millions and millions of Chinese participating in social media. A lot of possibilities for future research. We have continuous time measurements of Chinese government censorship activities in 85 and more topic areas where we can watch what happens. We can reveal information about state action when the traditional media is silent. So we have an example in an area where one of these monks, as a protest, lit himself on fire, and they go into this town, and the level of censorship goes to 100%. The level of posts go to 0. There's basically nothing. If you look at the media reports in this town, they're wondering what's happening. There's this protest, right? But this is sort of this isolated town. Media reports, after they report this guy lit himself on fire, stop. There's no more news about this town at all, because basically my interpretation is the troops went in, they shut down the town, they shut down all access to the town. Basically everything. We know that percent censorship stayed high there in anything about the town for about 6 weeks, and then percent censorship about that town and the monks dropped. So I don't know what happened, but my interpretation is the troops went in and they were there for 6 weeks. They calmed everything down. They shut it down. They cut out 100% of the media access, but we could still see something. Right? We could still see for 6 weeks they were still censoring. So the same kind of thing might be applicable to other countries, and these are my co-authors for some more information. So happy to take some more questions. Thanks.
All right, this is a question from Stanford. Who decides whether an event has collective action potential, individual censors or central authority?
That's a great question, right? What we think happens, and we have some direct evidence of this, is that there's central authority, which is itself a very complicated thing. It's not just like one guy, that they actually make the decision and communicate it down. Of course, there's a huge principal agent problem, right? The individual censors could be censoring, things about their parents or friends or whatever, right? But we think that's the process. So.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the challenges associated with differentiating between posts that were criticizing the government versus those that were supportive. If doing that via automated text analysis is now pretty accurate in English, if there were challenges associated in developing a version that would work in Chinese, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that wasn't that difficult. Just to be clear, coming up with a method that would individually classify a post as supportive or opposing the state, methods of individual classification don't work very well. Right? There are many methods of individual classification. They just, on average, they just don't work very well. However, for most purposes, we actually don't need to we don't need to do individual classification. We need to do things like estimate the percent of posts that are criticizing the state, the percent of posts that are supporting the state. And although you would think that all you need to do is do the individual classification and then add up, and if you get it, you'll get the other thing. And if you get every individual post individually classified correctly, you do get the overall number, but the individual posts are not correct. But we have a method, that's what this README thing is, in which we can estimate the percent in a category extremely accurately, even if the best individual classifier can only get 10% right. So that's the thing.
Hi. it's very exciting for you that this is coming out in the APSR, but it seems like there are much larger implications beyond academia, primarily not for its academic merit, but for its technical achievement. I think you could perhaps even call this spying to a certain extent. And not that I have any problem with that. We learned from the presidential campaign that the Chinese are the bad guys. But are other people interested in this? What are you doing with this other than publishing academic papers?
Some of this I think I'm going to describe over dinner. But yes, the governments of several countries are very interested in the subject. And we have communicated to our government what we had before we made it available. And they were quite interested. So, and they weren't doing anything like this. They had no idea. So, there's some really good people there, but they just weren't doing things like this. So, there were also 500,000 computers in China that took a liking to our servers. So,
I have 2 questions related to your methodology and classification. The first one is you're talking about tracking topics over time. There seems to be some evidence suggesting that the Chinese, in order to avoid censorship, start to use sort of different keywords that have symbolism. For example, if something happens on May 25th, they might write it as May 18th plus 7 to avoid censorship. How do you sort of track that over time and look at what posts are actually occurring over time? And then my second question is, when you're talking about classifying collective action potential, you mentioned people who have incited protests in the past. Is that based on people who are public figures, i.e. their proper names, or is that based on people's IP addresses, like who is citing something and the Chinese government is tracking the cookies of people who are visiting these sites?
So just to be clear, the Chinese government has information on these people that we don't have. So, and we do have IP addresses, but it's mainly what's being discussed, right? So that's the main thing. On your first question, which involves, remind me, sorry.
Tracking topics over time and whether people are using different keywords, if you will, over time.
Right, sorry. So this is why we need humans in the loop, right? So people can speak about the same subjects using completely different words. And the Chinese people are incredibly creative about changing the words they use. So for example, if you sign on to a social media site in China and you try to type a post in, they have keyword blocking. So if you use certain words in certain combinations, they'll say, nope, sorry, you can't post that. Well, how hard do you think it would be to rewrite that so that you could post it and say essentially the same thing? It's not hard, right? So they do have keyword blocking. It does slow you down. It can be a pain in the neck, but it doesn't really stop you, okay? So, but what that means is that the things that are posted can talk about the same subjects in many different ways. And that's really important, right? So if they're talking about the same subjects in many different ways and they change the way they talk about the subjects, then we need a methodology that can capture that. And so that's what we have. We have a computer-assisted method of automated text analysis rather than a fully automated method. So methods that count numbers of words that say different things, they work really well in the really short term sometimes, and then they fail catastrophically. So there was a group that was in the US trying to predict stock prices or unemployment rates from mentioning things like unemployment and jobs and relevant words. And it was tracking reasonably well, and they were predicting unemployment rates, and all of a sudden they saw this big spike in the number of mentions, and they just failed to notice that Steve Jobs, with the name Jobs, died that day. And then all of a sudden the counts of words had nothing to do with the thing that they were trying to measure. So automated text analysis is the kind of thing, sort of like survey research, that you can do a little bit of, reasonably well. But to get it right requires as much expertise as like a heart surgeon, right? But fortunately, nobody does heart surgery just a little bit. So we have methods that have humans reading, and they'll be able to interpret, the characters that look the same as another thing, but mean something completely different. And if you read Chinese, it will make sense to you. So I think that's.
I'm just wondering how well your censorship data actually maps onto the political sort of cycle in China's sort of calendar year. It looks like you have huge spikes in June, you have another spike in March, a little bit in October, for some of them. And for those of us who've lived there, we all know May to early June, it's really hard to get on the internet to places. The censors are revving up for June 4th. In March, they're revving up for the two giant parliamentary sessions. So I'm not sure if you're capturing variation in political sensitivity that the state is feeling, or if it's sort of this variation by topic. The other one is more of it's an unfair question because it really deals with the data that you don't have and the selection problem, because you are making the broad conclusion still that the implication is that it's not about government criticism, it's all about mobilization. But certain things like what the lady here just sort of intimated about, like Tiananmen, Falun Gong, these things you won't see the light. I mean, Tiananmen particularly, you won't see the light of day. So,
sorry, you mean posts about Tiananmen won't be?
No, yeah, posts about Tiananmen really don't make it. Like they.
That's not the case.
So
no, there's plenty of posts about Tiananmen. Of course, many of them are about buying rugs and walking through Tiananmen Square and. And there are. It's not hard to find posts that are making reference to the Tiananmen massacre online. However, however, it's definitely true if they're talking about a collective action event and they're suggesting that there be, then it's associated with an event that's happening now, then yeah, it'll be taken down.
But then I guess it still is, how do you parse out when is it government, because all protest events are government criticism, so how do you kind of parse out, this is just government criticism, this is totally collective action? You have it kind of I read the paper and you kind of sort of mentioned that you've been looking at, are there any specific indicators that you're looking at when you?
Well, we really put ourselves in the shoes of the censors. Like if we were really going to do this task, it would be very hard to read individual posts and decide whether it was criticism of the government or collective action. It would just be really, really hard for individual posts. But for events, it's not that hard. For an event, it's not that hard to figure out whether it has something to do with collective action, with moving people, or whether it has to do with talking about something else. Okay? And so we think that's the way they solve the intercoder reliability problem of censoring. Right? Your first question was about the not only individual censorship. Oh, that's great. But it was in China, sometimes just the internet gets really slow. Okay, I don't think that's an accident. Okay, I don't think. We know that during the 18th Party Congress, which just came recently, they just sort of slowed everything down. Right, like it just takes a while to sign on. It takes a while to get results from a website. They're just putting stuff in the in the gears to get it slowed down. That's a different mechanism they have. We didn't study that. And so it definitely could affect our results. But we're studying the biggest piece of what they're doing, and a very difficult one. But that's what we're aiming at.
Do you have some ideas on like you're kind of at an endpoint or the current point or issue in Chinese censorship, which is, as you've described, preoccupation with collective action and almost nothing else, a couple of smaller things. That's the big one. And so how did their censorship decisions evolve? It wasn't always this way. 10 years ago, were they so preoccupied, as you say, with collective action? Did they kind of realize, oh, we can't control this, the plus and minuses, all of those things that you've kind of figured, how did they go about? I'm talking about the evolution of the censorship system, and you have some, speculation on that. Originally, did they say anyone who says anything bad about anything, of our government whatsoever, they're a target? You think day one that would probably be the original thought. Now we have what seems like quite subtly involved lots of mass psychology going on there. What do we really care about? We can't manage this fire hose of noise. What is really going to keep us going? What are the dangerous points? And so it looks like they have the red button they decided is collective action.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of it, we manage indirectly or whatever. So I'm just questioning, do you have any thoughts maybe about how the evolution of that, is this a natural evolution? It all would have ended at that point.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's very clever, right? I mean, somebody at some point in China made the decision, you know what, we're going to allow posts. We're going to allow the Chinese people to speak and have other people to hear. I mean, you wouldn't have thought they would have even made that decision, right? So they made that decision, and then they also made the decision, you know what, they want to say something critical? Fine. They actually made that decision, right? We don't know exactly when they made the decision. I mean, I would love to go back and study historically when that happened, try to figure out who it was and things like that. I really don't know.
Seems like a pressure releasing system as well. I mean, you don't have the danger to the state business of mass action, say, but it relieves pressure to be able to criticize, you know, these outrageous corrupt officials and so on. At least I got to say something, and that's some satisfaction. Okay, then I sit back down.
I don't know if it. I mean, that's a very specific empirical hypothesis you have, that when people speak, it relieves pressure, and then they won't try to protest, and that may very well be the case, or maybe it will generate other people protesting. I'm not really sure. What I do think it is a motivation for this is trying to monitor all the local officials in a country like China. Like if you ruled China and you had local officials stealing all kinds of money or not keeping the people down like you want them to do, having a reliable measure of what the people think in all these different localities would be pretty valuable. So we know that they do survey research and stuff like that. This is much better than survey research for what they want. So it may be, I mean, I'm totally making it up. I don't have direct evidence for this. But it would make sense if they basically decided, you know what, let's let the people say whatever they want. We'll stop them if there's going to be any collective action, because we're strong enough. We can read every one of these posts. We can send the troops in if we want. We're not afraid of that. But we're going to have millions of Chinese citizens or Chinese people watching all these local officials that we have trouble monitoring. They're going to monitor them for us.
That's just what social media critics have said, that it's valuable for states to have all this information available. They're reading what's going on in the population. They have their finger right there on the most immediate personal stuff.
Yeah.
It's all in their hands.
Yeah, we've talked a lot to Western journalists that go to China, and Chinese journalists. Some of the Western journalists think that the reason they're allowed to operate in China is because they're basically serving the Chinese government. They're providing all this information and the dirt on all the local officials. And the central leadership really likes that. I mean, I have to be careful that we're constructing a story here without immediate evidence of, but it's very consistent with the facts. So.
This is great. I think we're running out of time. We can ask more questions of Gary right after we let everybody go. Thank you so much. We should thank Gary one more time.
Thanks, everybody.